Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be moderating this all-star panel. First, we'll be talking Veronica Zavala, who was the latest addition to the forum, and we're really, really happy that she can make it in the end. So Ms. Zavala is a Peruvian citizen, and currently she's the general manager of the Office of Strategic Planning and Development, Effectiveness at the Inter-American Development Bank. Until June 2013, Ms. Zavala was the general manager of the Country Department Andean Group. Earlier, she was sector manager for the Public Sector and Governance Unit for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. From 2008 to 2010, she was executive director for Colombia and Peru on the board of executive directors of the IDB and the Inter-American Investment Corporation. So if you're looking for a job in DC, seems like the person to talk to. During her public service career in Peru, Ms. Zavala has held many positions, including Minister of Transportation and Telecommunications from 2006 to 2008, coordinator of the Presidential Task Force to improve public sector modernization from 2006 to 2008, and Secretary of Public Management at the Prime Minister's Office from 2001 to 2002, and then from 2005 to 2006. In 2002, Ms. Zavala briefly left the public sector to join the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, working on issues that intersect public sector reform and informality in projects in Africa and Central America. Ms. Zavala holds a law degree from the Pontificia Universidad Católica in Peru and an MA degree in public administration from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here with you. I will talk about Latin America and the IDB. IDB it's the Inter-American Development Bank based in Washington, as you know. It's a unique institution in many ways, and I'll let you know why in a second, in the sense that it is perceived as an organization that belongs to Latin America, but it also is an organization that has many of the highest standards in the world in terms of how to do development work. When I was asked to talk here on social development, I was thinking how to address the issue, and at the time I was reading The Economist, and there was an article about this question. I mean, is there a trade-off between economic growth and redistribution? And of course, some people will say yes, some people will say no. The majority of you with an economic background will probably say it depends. But that is okay. And this article was before the Piketty one, which also builds into some things that I think it's very important to talk here, issues on redistribution and growth and how the two interact. And this goes to the core of what the bank, not what the bank has been doing, but what the bank understands is the future of its work. The IDB is 55 years old. It's no longer a young organization. It's an organization with a very long trajectory. It was founded at the same time as this iconic picture of Che Guevara was taken. It's 2 years before President Kennedy did all these initiatives regarding the Alianza para el Progreso. My research assistant told me that at that same year, the Chicago White Sox won, after 40 years, an important championship, and I should mention that, but okay. I am not that well aware of that last fact. But what is true is that we are an organization with a long trajectory of being the most important partner for development in Latin America. We are the biggest source of lending for the region. We are the biggest source of technical cooperation for the region. At the same time, that sounds super good, but 55 years ago, what the IDB could put in the table for the countries in terms of development was very, very important. It was large numbers that would really move the needle of what the finances in the different countries. Nowadays, fortunately, and I will talk a little bit more about this later, the countries have been growing, and we have bigger countries in terms of population, bigger countries in terms of GDP, in terms of capacities, and the challenges for an organization like the IDB are greater and of different nature. And that's why our thinking nowadays is more doing the right things and doing them right. We need to start sharpening our focus for working with the region, because the region, as I was saying, has changed a lot. I mean, when my bio was being read, I have only been 5 years in Washington. I've been 15 years in government, and I was a client of the IDB and the World Bank when I was in office. And when they came in 1993 or 1994 to my country, Peru, we were expecting those missions of those illuminated people from DC that were going to give us some big checks that would make the difference between paying the salaries of teachers or not. Nowadays, when the mission of the IDB comes to the country, nobody knows that they are coming. And some people will care because they are working with the IDB, and probably Mr. Blanco here will know. But in general, it's not a big thing. You don't go to the front page of the papers anymore. And that's because the countries have grown, have been improving, and also the capacities. I mean, the difference between Director General for Budget, almost any country in Latin America, and an official of the bank, the World Bank or the IDB, it's very little. Probably most of you, when you're thinking what to do, you value both alternatives, going back to your countries or joining one of these multilateral development banks or some other way of working in development. And that creates a lot of difference in the way the relationship goes. Talking about social sector, the way we traditionally have been involved in it, the IDB has put something like 40 billion in the last 20 years. This thing is to 2010, but from the last 3 years, we put 6 more billion, so it's basically $40 billion in the social sector, which is approximately a quarter of all the lending the bank has done. A big chunk of this has been into conditional cash transfers, which is something that the IDB has pioneered. The IDB has helped, has worked together, first with Mexico and Brazil in what they were doing, and then we were learning, but then taking that experience, transforming that into knowledge, and being able to help other countries replicate that. And not only that, but in the last 3 to 4 years, other regions of the world that do not have programs like those conditional cash transfers in Asia or in Africa are looking for the IDB to see if we can help them put in place those type of programs. It is not by chance that these kind of programs have helped people move out of poverty. I think it's a success of our region that we have moved many people out of poverty in the last 15 years. As President Fernandez was saying some minutes ago, in part it has been done given very good conditions in the global context, but it's also been the result of very good management in our countries and of creating new capacities at the country level that have been able to put in place this type of programs, which are very complex to do. I mean, if you think handing out cash transfers to populations in the most remote areas, it's a logistical challenge. But more of a challenge is the fact that nobody is complaining that this money is given to the people in the political party, same as the government is. So doing it technically, bringing people to have identity, I mean, the card, so that we can count how many people we have, bringing them out of poverty, being able to bring kids to school, measure how they are growing, doing much more preventive care. All those things are a step up in the level of sophistication that we see in the governments in Latin America. And I think multilateral banks like the IDB have played a role, we and the World Bank, in this issue. We have other priorities in our social areas. We have a capital increase 4 years ago, and we put some priority areas where we wanted to invest more. It's clearly, and it's linked to what I was talking in terms of conditional cash transfers in a way too, but investing in early childhood, being sure that the kids get to school age in good shape, improving the quality of schools, addressing youth that are at risk, labor markets and social security. It's not a mystery that Latin America is super informal, and that's one of the big challenges it has, social inclusion and that. But having said that, those are the right areas. The biggest challenge of Latin America is not to have a list of what are the key areas where we should be working, but to, in a way, recognize all the successes that I was mentioning and contrasting those with the challenges we have ahead. And I think that's the key part of what we need to, as an organization in the IDB, what we need to be focusing nowadays. What I'm talking about here is the fact that looking ahead in the future, what is it that will help Latin America not only leave behind poverty, not only take the good examples of some countries that have been really successful in addressing and combating poverty, but the next step, how to make our countries something like what happened in Asia, where countries were able to converge into the first world. There's not one country in Latin America that has converged into the first world. Chile has the objective of becoming average OECD in 10 years. And it's the country that it probably is closest to that goal. Because it's manageable, because the problems, social problems it has are manageable. But that same country last year had all the students in the streets complaining about inequality. That same country is amongst the 15 most unequal countries in the planet. So the challenge of Latin America is no longer only to defeat poverty, but the challenge is bigger. The challenge is to tackle inequality. And that is one of the biggest challenge of the region. I mean, all Latin American countries, with the exception of Haiti, are classified now, according to the classification of World Bank, as middle-income countries. I personally, and the IDB, I think fortunately, doesn't have a threshold of when you are middle income. Because this is a middle income that's not exactly what you will consider middle income in the rest of the world. So it's the middle income for poor countries is different than the middle income for richer countries. But still, I mean, now our population is out of that awful poverty. But, as I was saying, 15 out of the 15 more unequal countries in the planet, we have the privilege of having 14 of them. And that is, as I was saying, the way we at the bank are thinking of what is it we should be doing. We should be, for example, we should develop the ideas to help countries avoid the middle income trap. Example of that, for example, is how to help kids transition better from going out of school to work. Latin America has this enormous percentage of kids that are called the ninis. The ninis because ni estudian ni trabajan. It's not a joke, it's a dramatic thing. It's a catchy name, but that's the kind of thing that we should at the bank be doing. And when we talk to our clients, our shareholder borrowing countries, they say, what do they want from us? To work on those issues. Even the countries that are not facing those challenges because they still have poverty, they say, okay, we can see that we can emulate what you have done in other countries so that Honduras can become more of an Ecuador and then can become more of a Chile. But the problem is that after a Chile, we don't know how the path continues. And that is, I think, where the question at the beginning provides some light. It is not redistribution only and it is not growth only, it's trying to find ways by which we can tackle both at the same time. And for us, key is to be able to master those topics and help countries work on them. If I was saying to converge into that average of high-income countries, the average of OECD countries, no one country has converged with the levels of inequality that we have. That's one thing. The second thing has to do with productivity and innovation. I mean, if you do a regression of what explains where we are in terms of economic growth, and you take out the external crises, the ones that we didn't cause but suffer, the reason why we have not been growing at the levels that we should be growing has to do with the low level of productivity of our firms, especially the little firms, that many are survival firms, micro enterprises that are not very productive, and because we don't invest in innovation. If you see the numbers, and I haven't brought them here, but I'm happy to share with you, but if you see by 100,000 students, how many get a PhD in our countries? Is less than a fourth of what the average is in Asia. Even the poorest countries in Asia are at the level of our Chile or our Brazil, which is the other country that really invests, not really, that invests comparatively to the rest of Latin America, big numbers. And the third issue that where we should be working, if we think what makes us different from countries that have managed to converge, is the level of productive integration. And what I wanted to say with productive integration is to differentiate it from political integration. We have, in Latin America, we have, 17 different names for UNASUR, CECLAC, CIEPAC, many different ways of organizing ourselves politically to be a group of countries that can, Mercosur. But at the end, we create these things to integrate us productively, but they don't have really a grounding. Some good examples, for example, are in Central America with integration in terms of electricity, where there's a productive integration. Countries that have excess capacity can sell to the others. So there are some examples, and we believe that integration of companies, that one company can do a part of a product and the other country can do the next part, and create chains where each one puts the highest value they can provide competitively, so that as a region we can be more integrated. That's the way the integration goes in Asia. The only example similar to that is maybe Mexico with the US, but in general, we don't have much of an integration. To put it in numbers, commerce within the region is 25%, in Asia it's 45%, in Europe is 65% intra-regional commerce. That's the kind of thing we should also be looking if we want to avoid the trap and converge into being a region that is in a path transitioning to a future that is completely different. Basically, the challenges are the ones I was mentioning. In terms of perspectives, we believe in the bank that we should be more and more a bank that learns with the region and that helps the region learn from itself. We think that we have very good examples back there, but we are not that as good in replicating, escalating what we're doing. We also believe that we have a very important role to play in helping the countries improve their capacities, the institutionality to bring about reforms. The IDB is not into the political side of things, and that helps us work with all the different governments, but we are concerned here mostly in terms of the capacity to deliver the policies and the programs that a country wants to do. And for that, you need to have certain conditions, and that's something where the bank will also be working very highly. I want to tell you one example of how one side of the economic growth and the social side go together. I provided some USBs for you, where we have many examples of the things we're proud of. Also, there's a good chapter in that USB that I provided with our failures. We are very keen into learning from our failures because we think it's we shouldn't lose 2 times. If we fail, we should use that as a learning experience, and that's for us very key. But I think I'm out of time. Yeah, okay, so those are the examples of how economic growth and the redistribution work together. Many of them are in the DEO, the Development Effectiveness Overview, the publication of the bank, and I really invite you to take a look at them, and I think there are some examples that are valuable for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now, I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gonzalo Hernández, who we're very happy to have here. He is the Executive Secretary of the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, Coneval. This autonomous public organization is dedicated to generate objective information on the social and political situation in Mexico to better inform policy decision-making in the region. So they do what kind of Harris wants everyone to do, which is kind of cool. As Executive Secretary, Dr. Hernández coordinates the activities of the Council and makes sure all agreements and actions decided by the Board and the Commission of the body are carried out. He holds a PhD degree from the University of Oxford and has previously served as the Head of Evaluation and Monitoring at the Ministry of Social Development and is full-time professor at the Instituto Autónomo de México, el ITAM. From 1996 to 2000, he served as an academic representative to the North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation Commission. He is now also a part-time professor at ITAM. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hernández.
Well, thank you very much to everyone. Congratulations to the Latin American Matters and Harris School. Thank you to Marina for inviting me directly. And thank you, Marina, for advising me that it's going to be rainy and cold in Chicago today. When you and me, when we go to the doctor, of course we go there asking for some answers from our health. We are hoping that the doctor is going to give us the proper medicine for us to get better. And sometimes in the middle of that, what we have, it's some measurements. Sometimes we have measurements of our blood, some x-rays and all that. And all those measurements are there for the doctor to improve the medicine he will be delivering for us. And that's, of course, we agree on that. Unfortunately, if doctors started lying about the measurements, if they hide what you have, or if you get really angry with the doctor because of the results he gave you, then you have problems of trust, of mistrust. And I think that happens exactly the same in social policy, in public policy in general. I mean, public policy in general is difficult. I mean, there is no single book, not even the IDB, telling us exactly what to do in terms of poverty, in terms of reduction of inequality. And therefore, we have to do a lot of trial and error. But we need to measure the size of our problems. If we don't measure things, it is difficult to improve them. So what I'm going to tell you right now is small history of what happened in Mexico recently for terms of measurement, evaluation, and results. And that's why I'm calling this talk Accountability, Measurement, and Results. When you think about constructing a monitoring and evaluation system in a country, unlike what it happens with a doctor, you need at least two main challenges. Of course, a very important one is a technical one. We need to have information, we have to have data, we may need to have trained evaluators, PhD people like you, or masters like you, where you understand very well economy, when you can measure things. Those are important. If we want to measure and evaluate things, we need technical elements. But also, we do need institutional elements. We need to change the rules of the game in order for the evaluation to be there always. I remember when I arrived from my PhD to the Ministry of Social Development to the General Direction of Evaluation. And I was, with my team, really trained in terms of evaluation. And the first thing we did was we knocked the door of the first social program, said, good afternoon, we are from the new team of evaluation, and we are here to evaluate and measure your program. I said, what are you doing here? Well, we're here to evaluate because we have all the good techniques about impact evaluation and all that, the counterfactual, all those are things important to understand if your program has impact or not. I said, well, I've been here 5 years, and I know much better about my program than you, so why don't you come next year? So we understood that in order to have a systematic way of measuring things, we needed to change the rules of the game. We need to change matters in the institutional element. Therefore, I always believe that constructing an evaluation system, it's a political element with some technical issues and not the other way around. And that's why in Mexico, we had a long way in trying to change these institutional elements. Fortunately, the President Hernández had an extraordinary talk about the struggle of Latin America in terms of democracy. I just want to tell you and remind you that we came, at least in Mexico, from authoritarian governments. It doesn't mean that we didn't have elections. We did have elections every 6 years. Sometimes we didn't trust about the elections, but more importantly, we used to have very strong presidents which control everything. And it was very difficult for citizens to trust in various of those issues, especially about official statistics. In Mexico, we used to tamper with the inflation rate. Huh? What was the inflation rate last month as a president? Whichever you want it to be, Mr. President. If you change things, then it's difficult for you to build trust. And it's difficult for everybody to understand what the problem is. Fortunately, after some decades, we had, around 1997, our first balance of power between Congress and the president. For the first time, we had a party which was a different party from the one of the president, and then things started to change, at least in terms of demanding a better information and accountability. And it's not a coincidence that between 1997 and today, there have been various institutional changes demanding for transparency and measurement. One of those changes was the creation of this independent evaluation office. It's called Coneval, the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Programs, which is an independent institution which has two mandates: to measure poverty in a multidimensional way. I will focus on that, and the evaluation of social programs with a very, I think, a novel way of governance. Despite the fact that Coneval is within the executive, the board has 8 seats. 6 of those seats belong to 6 academics which were elected by the states, municipalities, Congress, and the executive. Therefore, they are independent from the president. The president did not appoint those 6 academics. Therefore, it is easier at Coneval to be independent about the figures of poverty and the evaluation figures. So that governance structure was novelty. And the second mandate from Congress about Coneval is to measure poverty in a multidimensional way, which also was new for Mexico. We understand that income poverty is very important to understand. Income is still there as a very important element here, but also there is also access to health services, educational gap, access to social security, quality of houses, services in houses, access to food, etc. All those yellows, by the way, are part of social rights. Therefore, our way of measuring poverty in Mexico has 2 different but important elements: the income element and also a social rights approach. In fact, the definition of poverty in Mexico is as follows. Is a person poor when she's got an income below a certain threshold, as a normal income line, but also if that person has at least one social deprivation in these terms. And this is a very important tool because it means very specifically that in order to reduce poverty, we need to tackle both social deprivations through the typical social policy, and also we need to improve incomes. The challenges you mentioned are there behind. And for some time, I believe the Mexican government thought that the only way to reduce poverty was only through social programs. And not only social programs, through one single ministry, the Ministry of Social Development. And with this approach, it is clear that other ministries should be involved in reducing poverty. And of course, the economic element, it is there. With this in mind, we had our first figures, and this is what we were able to show in the year 2011. Because now poverty is measured through different dimensions, then we're able to show that, fortunately, many of the deprivations decreased, therefore coverage increased, meaning that the government was doing something well in terms of social policy. The reduction in deprivation of health services, social security, housing, and education, they were there. Unfortunately, on this period, the middle of the crisis, 2009, the deprivation of food increased and also increased the number of people below an income threshold. So the income problem was there, and it's not only that the income problem has been there only for that specific period. For almost 30 years, Mexico hasn't been able to improve real income for its citizens, and therefore it is easier to see that in order to reduce poverty, in order to tackle poverty, those elements have been all right, those elements are not all right, and on net, poverty increased by 3.2 million people in that period. So A, we were able to disentangle poverty, and B, we were able to say that poverty increased to the president. He was not very happy, of course, but the institutional arrangement was possible for us to say that. In other circumstances, perhaps the president will say, well, why don't you hide that number? Or why don't you change that number? In Mexico, we are beyond that, fortunately. So, using a multidimensional approach for policy purposes, I think is a right path to go. For instance, in the year 2013, a year ago, the President and the Ministry of Social Development established poverty strategies and goals for all ministries with this tool. So what was surprising for us, honestly, is that we thought that a new president with a new party, they were going to perhaps abolish that multidimensional measurement, or they're going to thought that this was from a previous party. Fortunately, the president took this measurement in his hands, and now most of those social development policies have to do with that. Andres was telling me that even local governors are now very interested in trying to reduce poverty using this method. Of course, they're working for their people, but they are also on a political pressure because we produce figures for all governors every 2 years. And in Puebla, they suffer an increase in poverty over the past 2 years. And luckily as well, I can say all political parties use and I think believe in these poverty figures. Also the press. So finally, I really believe that measuring poverty in a multidimensional way helps governments to do better in terms of public policy. Poverty is a multidimensional phenomenon and should be tackled in a multidimensional way. And finally, if we measure social problems in a truthful way, I think this should be a very important element for any modern democracy. Democracy is not only about voting every 6 years. Democracy is also about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. I'm also very happy to introduce our following guest. One of the missions of LAM is to bring Latin America to the U.S., but the other mission is to bring the U.S. to Latin America. And with that in mind, we wanted to bring in an American speaker, and so we had a hard time finding one who would come. So, maybe you can help us more next year. But we're happy that we found you, and so. We found out Mr. Mark López, who's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. As the son of a former Peace Corps director, Mr. López got a close look at poverty while spending his childhood in Brazil and Ecuador. Shortly after earning a degree in music, López realized he did not want to focus on just one discipline. He joined the Peace Corps in Paraguay and got his master's degree in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government before serving as a staff member in the U.S. Senate. Today, as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean, he helps USAID carry out bilateral assistance to the region. He speaks of the agency's progress and its needs to Congress. He admits that acting as a liaison for international development and the political arena can be tricky, and we hope to hear a little bit more about that today. So, join me in welcoming Mr. López.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here and resisting the temptation to enjoy the fantastic day, which I think we're all anxious to do. And it's always challenging to talk to people after lunch because, of course, there's a lot more going on in our thoughts. So I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, hopefully reduce it down, and anxious to have some questions and answers. I'll give a little bit about what AID is, since there may be some that don't have a lot of background. It's fun to speak outside of Washington. I have to actually use the full words. I can't use the acronyms that we're so accustomed to in Washington. And it's also unique for me to be in a room where I think I'm the only U.S. government official. Normally, I'm in a room full of people who I know, most of which I talk to on a regular basis. And most of which who will get me in trouble if they hear what I say and if I stray from the official line. So I know that this is all a group with mucha confianza. Although it's being recorded, I'm sure we can sort of resolve that afterwards. So please don't get me in trouble. So USAID is the U.S. government's effort for development assistance, bilateral development assistance. So it's U.S. taxpayer money that goes for assistance all around the world. It is the largest bilateral development agency in the world. In Latin America, there were days where our assistance package totaled $3 billion. Lots of extensive transportation infrastructure networks. Now we're at about $1 billion in the last few years, and decreasing with some speed, which I want to talk about in a moment. And that effort is spread out around 12 countries currently in the region through sectors like citizen security prevention, which we heard about earlier today, the environment and climate change, democracy and governance programs, as well as some health programs that are diminishing, and I can explain why, as well as some education programs that are focused in a particular couple of areas. The largest of our efforts is in Haiti. Obviously, for obvious reasons and for obvious challenges, particularly after the earthquake. After that, Colombia, Guatemala, Peru, and then sort of down from there, we can talk about sort of how we think about investments in the region and what's sort of the strategy moving forward. our missions, we have about 100 people in a large mission like Colombia, and that's a group of people, most of whom are hired locally and are technical experts, and they work in country to divide up the grants and advance particular policies in concert with the governments in the country. Just background, I'm a political appointee, so I'm a short timer within the administration. I am inherently focused on the U.S. political piece because I'm based in Washington, and a lot of what I do is sort of try to fix problems that are more political problems, either with the White House, the State Department, or the Congress, when things get tricky around development assistance. And certainly development assistance in some ways is a very technical operation where you have immunizations that need to get a certain coverage rate so that you can stamp out certain diseases. But of course, there are other elements of this that is certainly rubbing against typical power structures, traditional political interests, constituencies of many, many kinds. So I don't think there's any part of this operation, and I think any part of public policy for those in the program here at the Harris School that is absolutely separated from a lot of those tricky and difficult to navigate forces. And I think that's where the power comes in, and the integration of politics, policy, but with the execution and that requires sort of technical wherewithal. So first on the tone, which I think has been interesting to hear today, and it's again great to be outside of Washington. If you took a gander, every morning at 6 a.m. I get an email with probably a 200-page summary of the region's headlines. And I promise I don't read them all every day, but if you just do a quick scan of that entire headline, you'll get a certain sense of what the tone is around the headlines around the region. I would just say that I think the tone today was different than what we see in those headlines. And I think that's an important distinction, and I would encourage people to sort of ponder as to why that is. I'm not sure I have the best answer, but I think it's a good thing that we're here focused on, largely, substantive, relevant efforts in advancing shared interests and mutual, concerns around security, around health, around education. And I think that's indicative of a maturation of relationships throughout the region, not just between the U.S. and countries in the region, but among countries across. I enjoyed Veronica's comments around, the role of donors in the region, and how maybe 10 years ago, Veronica would show up on an airplane and boy, like that was a big deal. Like that everyone would rise up and like there's front page news and a mission from the IDB. The same with a U.S. government official. We would get a tremendous deference with respect to investments that are being made in the country. Today it's a different landscape, and I think that's a very healthy change that has come recognizing that it's not about an American showing up on an airplane or a foreigner or a donor with a solution of one kind or another, but it's really about problems are tricky and they're hard, and it's not something that's going to happen with a couple of visits, but rather a bigger approach, a bigger system that certainly can use expertise from wherever it may come from, but not dependent on that expertise. I was also happy to hear today the talk about the region and how it's changed, and the positive sort of tone that has come out of both President Hernández and others around the 4% average growth rate over the last 10 years, the 73 million people that have been lifted out of poverty in the last decade. This is a big deal. It's a big change, and it's, I think, something we all need to look at as to what's the value add of a particular donor or a particular initiative. How are we uniquely useful in the context of a changing landscape, and a landscape that's changing very quickly. Certainly the problems are not over. There's inequality, there's distribution, there is security, but there's a lot of optimism and reason for hope, and I think a reason for continuing to evaluate our respective postures around how we engage with mutual interests. What are the things that need to rise to the top of the list, and what are the things that we can just let drop away? So just 2 minutes on, how our approach has changed in the last 10 years. I think for anyone in the room that's under 30, you grew up in a time when, in the 80s, when a lot of the history that President Fernandez went through, I think very aptly, wasn't part of your day-to-day, and it was barely part of my day-to-day. I came in at the very tail of that, and I think looking today, starting new, obviously recognizing the historical context, but looking forward, we should see a different way of engaging, and we should see a method to the approach that is more indicative of the days that we live in now, rather than more like what took place in the 70s, 60s. So part of that, 3 pieces I want to go through. 1 is the private sector. 2 is working with in a trilateral manner, which I'll explain in a second. And 3 is kind of going more local. So first, on the private sector, I was happy to hear the colleagues on the panel this morning talk about some of the investments that they've made from a business perspective in communities around the region. That's certainly something that's been happening for some time. We as a donor have tried to work with those private interests to try to merge both their business interests as well as a social good. That's not just so we can get more money into this process, although as a donor I actually love asking companies for money, and I aggressively work to shake down companies, because I think those investments are not just additional resources into it, but if you get the private sector who are ever more focused on results, really tough about seeing impact, I think you have another constituent that is aggressively monitoring the impact of any investment, and I think that's a good thing. So second, on the trilateral work, this is recognizing that, again, the American solutions are not the ones that are appropriate for anybody, much less elements within our country now. So expertise throughout the region is very strong, and so we are looking to serve more as a broker as our budgets decrease and we look to pivot and focus on other areas. We're trying to connect, for example, the Brazilian agricultural ministry equivalent, Embrapa, that have tremendously deep roots in agricultural expertise. They're working in Africa, in Mozambique. They're working some now in Haiti. We're working with them in Honduras and signed an agreement to work together on helping to advance value chains for rural farmers. We think this makes tremendous sense, right? So it's not about American ingenuity or American expertise, but expertise and ingenuity from wherever it may come from. And I think it makes a lot more sense over the long run, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, that expertise come from the region, and that the relationships that would come from that would be able to be drawn upon for decades to come. So other examples are working with Chile in Paraguay, with Chilean customs officials that go to Paraguay to talk about improvements on the customs process, as well as Uruguay and Paraguay on tax reform. And then Colombia, some work on violence prevention in Central America, which I think makes a lot of sense as well, given the challenges in Central America. We're also working to connect U.S. cities, Los Angeles in particular, and their ability to identify the challenges with gangs in Los Angeles. We've worked in El Salvador and other countries in Central America, looking to help convey the experience that we had with respect to targeting and violence. What we found was in our cities was it wasn't just every 9-year-old to 29-year-old was viciously out there carrying out violence, but in fact it was a certain subset in a particular neighborhood of 5 or 15 or 20 people on a Wednesday night on this street corner between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. It was a very, very focused effort that was actually responsible for the vast majority of the criminal acts. So how do you target? Well, you need data and you need information to carry that out, so we've looked to build on that. So I think that's sort of the general spirit of of where AID is looking now, I think we've set a date that I wanted to convey. We've talked about it before. 2030 is a date where AID should be a skeleton of what it is now in terms of the Latin America Bureau. Our programs should look vastly different, and that is along the spirit of working ourselves out of a job, and we want to be aggressively working to find ways where we can end assistance. And President Obama has said, the idea of foreign assistance, the whole spirit behind it is to create the conditions whereby foreign assistance is no longer necessary. So that's the overall goal, and I think when we think about, a date like that, even though it's 2030, well, it's really, it's only 16 years away, and like once you start doing the math, it's actually a pretty urgent effort to transition our programs, look for people who are going to carry the baton over the long term, and I think that's exactly the kind of aggressive orientation that we should be putting towards building on the positive developments that have happened over the last 10 years, and really looking forward to the kind of prosperous region that I think we're all here looking to see come true and be sustained, in the democratic tradition that is now the vast majority of the region's government. So thank you so much for having me today, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you for that. I'd just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions, to just write them down in cards, and a member of our team will be going around the table and picking those up. So do that kind of now. So our last speaker, her name is Marian Vidaurri, and she's a member of the Executive Office of the Organization of American States, the OAS. So we're also very happy because I think that organization kind of embodies what we aspire LAM to be. So this international organization is involved in promoting the advancement of democracy, human rights, security, and development in the American continent. She is currently the Secretariat for Political Affairs at the OAS, and she holds a BA in Government from Cornell and a Master's of Science in Latin American Politics from the University of Oxford. She is married, and probably she told me to tell you that the most important thing of her whole curriculum, she erased everything, but she wanted me to tell you that she has 2 kids, and that's the most important thing. So, jumping on, Ms. Vidaurri.
So yeah, the first thing I have to say is that I'm not the Secretary for Political Affairs. They would kill me if they heard that in Washington. I work for the Secretary for Political Affairs, which is slightly different. But thank you. I'm thrilled to be here for different reasons. One, because, well, it's great to be at this great university, so famous, and I always wanted to come, so thank you for inviting me. Second, because I've seen some very good friends that I haven't seen in a very long time, which is great, always to see friends. And last but not least, because I feel really glad and proud to be one of the 3 women panelists in this forum. And gender and gender equality, well, it's a social issue, it's a political issue, it's an economic issue, so it's great, feels good. And this is the most equal panel of them all. So great. So just as Mark said, I have to say this is my disclaimer. I will be speaking on my behalf, and what I mention, my comments are my opinions, and they do not reflect the opinions of the Organization of American States. So there, it's on tape. Having said that, I work at the Secretariat for Political Affairs at the OAS. It's one of the 6 secretariats in this multilateral organization, which is the oldest one in the Western Hemisphere. Over 100 years. It was refounded in 1948 as the OAS, and it's one of the oldest in the world. So it's a big thing, and with all of its strengths and weaknesses, it is the multilateral arena, political arena par excellence in this hemisphere. It's comprised of 34 member states, as you know, and it has 4 main pillars of action. One of them is democracy, another is human rights, security, and development. So this is, of course, the issue of development is The Secretariat who takes care of that is the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development. But because I come from the political science world and because I work at the SPA, how we call the Secretariat for Political Affairs, I will be focusing on what I consider the most pressing challenge in our region, in Latin America, and the Caribbean as well. But mostly like Latin America, and Veronica mentioned it, it's inequality. And I will focus on the politics and the policy implications of inequality in the region. So a few comments on that. So first, just a word on why it's important to promote the social agenda. There are many definitions of democracy out there, and I mean, it's incredible how nowadays some governments may call democracies their own governments, and they might not cover a set of requirements. You can go from the most minimalist definition of just holding elections to the most complex definition, but in this case, the connection between the social agenda, the development issues, and democracy goes in the sense that I see democracy as has three parts, and it has been mentioned as well: the social rights, political rights, and civil rights. So if you comply with the political rights requirement, you would have an electoral democracy. If you comply with the political rights and the civil liberties part of the requirement of democracy, you would be what Zakaria called a liberal democracy. But if you have a democracy, and if you judge a democracy by results, by the goods and services that a democracy delivers, well, that's more of the actual democracy that responds to the demands of social rights. So in this sense, that's how I view as the connection between our democratic regime and the issue of social development and why inequality hampers social development. So at the OAS, we have lots of mandates. Some people even criticize us for having lots of mandates, but they are important because it reflects a consensus on certain issues. So I'm just going to mention three. The Inter-American Development Charter mentions specifically the interdependence between economic and political and social development. Also, we have our own social charter, which was signed in the General Assembly in 2012 in Bolivia. And even this year, and this is another important reason why my focus on inequality, the General Assembly that will be held in Asunción, Paraguay, the theme is development with inclusion. So we're again bringing that topic to discussion. And in the first week of June, if you follow the news, you'll see a declaration that's going to be signed, and most likely the issue of the importance to promote equality, economic equality, and equality of access to different rights is going to be at the center. It's going to be the main focus. So now the good stuff. So inequality. It's such a broad topic. It's important to mention two main things about inequality in the region. Two good pieces of news. The Gini coefficient in the last 10 to 15 years, according to the World Bank, has decreased. And around 12 countries have decreased the levels of inequality, being El Salvador, Ecuador, Brazil, and Mexico and Argentina, the countries that decreased the equality the most. But still, besides that slight improvement in the last decade or so, we are still the most unequal region in the world, more so than Southeast Asia and poorer regions like Sub-Saharan Africa. And I mean, it's worrisome because according to Latino Barometer as well, 7 out of 10 Latin Americanos think that the distribution of income is unjust. So that's not a good thing to have. So that has political implications. Why? Because democracy, although we've seen with our keynote speaker, President Hernández, gave a great sort of history recap of Latin America in the 20th century and these 14 years. Yeah, we've had transitions to democracy. We've had processes of democratization, and that has meant the explosion of political rights, but not necessarily other rights, and not necessarily economic equality. So democracy hasn't necessarily meant development in an inclusive way. So we're sort of like reproducing what we reproduced for many decades, the economics conditions, politics conditions, economics. And the distribution of power is a reflection of the distribution of income in the region. So a reflection of this is, for instance, you guys study policy, tax policy in Latin America. Why, besides the fact that we recognize it's a very, efficient way of redistributing gains, why haven't we been able to promote and enact an efficient fiscal reform in the region? And Latin America is one of the regions that has the lowest tax revenues in the world as well. Well, because the problems of incentives. So you have in Latin America elites, political elites and economic elites. And political elites, they're not gonna run a campaign based on the idea that they're gonna raise taxes or that they're gonna widen the tax base. And the economic elites will not like the idea as well of raising taxes, or even if they're progressive, in the danger of losing their position in that distribution of power. So that's part of the reason why it's been very hard to promote an effective tax policy, and it's part of the reflection of the interaction between economic inequality and the political inequality in the region. But inequality also undermines democracy and representation. And for instance, if you take the electoral participation rates, I don't know if you know the Latin American Public Opinion Project. So they did their edition in 2012. Their results indicated that people with a higher level of education and a higher level of income had a higher participation rate than lower income quintiles. So the top quintile voted in an 82% rate, and the bottom one voted in a little bit over 65%. So that has implications because if people from the lower quintiles do not vote, their interests are not represented at the level of the political elites. So you reproduce this phenomenon, this trend of sub-representation, unequal representation. So inequality, again, has political implications, and it's important. There's another good example. I was just, last week I was going through some literature, and a recent study as well indicated how in parliaments in the region, even though the working class in Latin America comprises 80% of the population, their representation in parliaments is just a little bit over 10%. So there you see the huge gap that we still have to sort of fill in. So, and just a way to conclude, what this all means is that citizens in the region do not feel that their interests are represented, and inequality has to do a lot, explains a lot. And this is not good for democracy. 1 out of 4 citizens in the Americas feel their leaders, according to La Pop as well, do not listen to their interests at all. And coupled with the fact of the crisis of representation that we encounter in the region as well. And half of the citizens in the hemisphere think, according again to Latino Barometro, that their governments are not capable of solving their problems. So they don't even have trust in the government's capacity for public administration. So all of these things combining are some of the challenges that inequality brings upon our political regimes. So as a way to conclude, I like what one scholar mentioned. I always have trouble pronouncing it, Przorsky, that democracy was a political revolution, but not an economic one. And to make our club of democracies, because that's what we call the OAS sometimes, a club of democracies, stronger, we need to pay attention to the rising social demands that are coming in our region. And what again, President Fernandez mentioned about the rise of the middle class. And the capacity of the state to deliver goods and services needs to improve as well, because then the demand for social demands will not be at par with the supply of social policy. So if we are to face the future, one of the theme of the forum, I mean, I can't predict anything, but we will have to face at least this. Inequality and democracy will continue to coexist in Latin America, in the hemisphere. And the social demands from the middle class will continue to rise and will continue to coexist in this context of inequality. And so a social agenda must be constructed, but it's very important to note that it must be constructed without undermining democratic institutions, because it has cost us so much to get where we are. Coups and the last decade that we mentioned a lot, wars in Central America, economic crisis and reforms, that we cannot sacrifice those democratic and institutional gains that we've gained. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask my questions from here. So I got a lot of questions for, I'm going to start here because it seems that it's the question I got the most. And it's for Mr. López. There's given in your unofficial capacity, I think that's probably better for this question. So it says, the OAS has been criticized for its slow reaction, if any, against the human rights violation in Venezuela. Insulsa is particularly, that's for you.
That's for me.
Yeah, but USAID, we got the same question, so I guess you both can answer it. So then we'll start over here and then we'll go to Mr. López, sorry. Basically, Insulsa has been accused of protecting the agenda of the likes of Chavez and Maduro and Kirchner. So you can answer that. And then to Mr. López, which I got the question was about the USAID. Insofar as it's been kind of financing the destabilizing activities of governments like the Venezuelan government. So I guess you can both give a perspective, the unofficial perspective on that.
Sure, I'll start. And I've been in politics long enough that there's no such thing as unofficial. So, so this is what I'll say. Look, I think it's interesting that there was a hearing today in Washington from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Senator Menendez, whom I used to work for, and Roberta Jacobson, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere Affairs. So this is a very active conversation. It is a very troubling set of events that have taken place there. I think if people are following it, you know that there's been an effort to bring the United States into a dialogue that would certainly, I think from our perspective, change the focus of the conversation from where we believe it needs to be, which is between the Venezuelan people and their government, to an engagement between the United States and Venezuela. We know how that conversation goes. We know what that narrative sounds like. We've been involved in that before. I'm not sure that anyone sees that as helpful, except maybe a government that wants to distract from the dynamics that are going on internally. So I think that the conversation between the Venezuelan people and the government is where we want to continue to allow the focus to be. Beyond in terms of the accusations of us funding folks for destabilizing, that is a common refrain as well, one that was based more on activities before I was born than anything that I've seen in my career. That said, we certainly carry out assistance to people in societies whose rights are being violated. That includes Venezuela, that includes Cuba, that includes another dozen countries around the world, whereby that assistance to those people may not be a welcome set of investments. They may be threatened by our providing humanitarian assistance to political prisoners, for example, our providing efforts to get the voices in a place whose people's voices are being tempered by an authoritarian government that is not allowing those voices to be heard either in that country or outside of that country. And so the commitment on the part of this administration, which is not unlike the commitment on the part of many previous administrations, not just Democratic but Republican as well, remains, and is one where we will reach out to groups who are trying to exercise basic human rights, as well as supporting the development of civil society, supporting information flow on basic news headlines and free media and free press and the journalism training, these kinds of things. It's an area I didn't talk about, but I'm certainly happy to talk about more. But that is where the AID sort of assistance part of this comes in, and it's very consistent with what we've done, not just in Venezuela for some time, but also around the region and around the world. Thanks.
So, of course, I cannot answer that question directly, but I can tell you this. The OAS is what its member states want the OAS to be. And so, if there isn't a consensus, particularly in the Permanent Council, on what to do with regards to this or any other situation in the region, the General Secretariat is limited in its action. And I mean, the geopolitics of the region has changed a lot in the last decade or so. And a clear example of it is that in 2001, when the Inter-American Democratic Charter was signed, the whole international context was completely different. You were coming out of a decade where, you know, all we could say was, well, not me because we were young, but the triumph of liberal democracy, you know, the end of the Cold War and the triumph of democracy, and it was just easier to get together in a table and agree upon a set of values and sign a charter as such. If you were to sign that charter today, you wouldn't be able to sign it because, you know, it just, things are different and the relationship between the states are different. And so that, you can see that expressed in the way countries behave or say or don't say, more importantly, what they don't say in the Permanent Council. And so it applies with the case of Venezuela. So that's what I can say.
Thank you. So, Ms. Zavala, you talked about one of the main reasons for the lack of growth in the region, and you mentioned productivity and the lack thereof. So I was just interested on why we don't see any growth in this area as opposed to in other countries or other regions. Why productivity remains low in Latin America?
Thank you for the question. I think that productivity is super intertwined with informality. We have a region that has more than 50% informality, and when you're informal, then you don't, it's not only a matter of not paying taxes, it has to do with not investing in training people because you don't have relationships that are for the longer run. A lot of companies are not companies, but much more ways of individuals to find a means because these people given a job, a formal job probably they would have taken. So we have low investment in the firms, but even for that level of investment, productivity is low given the conditions. I think that informality, and with informality comes also the trust in institutions. It's key. It's a key element that we need to work so that we can have an economy that invests more. I mean, the saving rates in Latin America are also very low compared to what we need. So we save little, we invest little, and we don't have like a longer run vision in the smaller companies. Productivity in the multilatinas, which Latin America also has, it's very big, and we have seen companies from Brazil buying and expanding into other regions. Same with Mexican companies. Argentinian companies have left and been super productive in other regions, but it's in the smaller companies that we see that lack of productivity.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask a few questions to Gonzalo. So I don't know if you know this, but you're in a room full of data nerds. So everyone's was really excited about Coneval, and so some of these questions are a little idolatrous of the institution. I'm not going to read one of them because it's too much, but one of them is actually just they're all very curious about how it works and what the future of it is. So one of them in particular, how does the role of the change in the administration, what role does that play in the future of the Coneval in terms of both its capability and its autonomy?
Great. Nice questions, and important ones for this moment. So I think the key part, let me give you an example of how Coneval works. So we set up our multidimensional poverty methodology, which I explained briefly later. And every 2 years, we release poverty figures for a national and state level, and every 5 years for the municipality level. So this is the mechanism we do have. And pay attention that transparency is at the core of it. So the statistical office releases the survey, it's a household survey, every 2 years. So they release the survey. The survey is public. So at that moment, we take the survey, and then we apply to the survey the formula, which is in Stata, SPSS, and R, and then we produce the figures within the following 5 years. And that formula is also public. So anyone in Mexico, anyone in the world, by the way, can replicate the poverty figures. And if they do that correctly, they should have exactly the same figures as we produce. And that is very important in terms of transparency, because we are telling everyone, including the government, measuring poverty is a transparent way of doing things. And therefore, it's very difficult to try to change that formula. If someone is tempted to change the formula, very quickly, anyone should spot that. So that's a very important way to do that. What about the future? Well, as you may know, in Mexico, we are in the middle of an autonomous process in Coneval, which seems like a very good idea. In practice, it may not be a very good idea. Because in practice, it's good that we may have an autonomy in terms of budgets, and we won't be placed in the executive anymore, which may be, perhaps it's important. However, we don't know yet how Congress is going to elect the new council members of Coneval. I told you before, those 6 council members, which were elected in a different way before, they have been the shield against any thought of trying to change things or temporary things. We don't know yet the way Congress is going to elect the new council members, and there's a fear that we may have, as in other institutions, a way in which parties are going to select 2 for PRI, 2 for PAN, 2 for PRD. So I don't imagine, technically, a debate about poverty figures when you have in the middle political parties or the government. So the future, it's unclear.
Well, that's sad.
Like you say, save the whales, save Coneval.
Well, okay, so then that brings us kind of good to, there's a lot of questions, I think, about sort of failures and successes, looking forward and looking back for all the panelists. And I guess I'll start with a question for Mr. López is, what are the most successful projects of USAID in Latin America? and how do you measure their success?
Great. Thank you. And I think I liked Veronica's comments earlier about failures and learning from failure, because that's a theme that it's taken us a long time to get to a point where we can raise our hand and say, you know what, we had this great idea and we tried it and we threw millions of dollars at it. Turned out it was a terrible idea and didn't work at all, and all that money's sort of gone. Because I think it's important for us to do that at key times, because we're dealing with very tricky situations and problems that are not easy to solve. And in some cases, we're grasping for things that are going to work, because the acute nature of violence prevention and the number of deaths that are happening on a daily basis merits an incredibly aggressive approach. We can't wait till all the data comes in and all the analysis says, okay, if you take one step forward, you're probably going to move 3 feet forward. No, we can't wait that long. We don't have that luxury, so we need to try things. And so I think we need to be able to also recognize that with that investment comes some failure. It's also a conversation that we have to have with our Congress, and we continue to do so, because as you might expect, when U.S. taxpayer money is quote unquote wasted in an investment that doesn't pan out, that is not something that the Congress wants to see happen, and obviously the American people don't want it to see that happen, so we have to give that full explanation of the value of those investments in addition to those that pay off. I think in terms of what worked, there's a couple different answers. There's a couple of sort of small project successes, and I think some of the most creative ones there are things around partnerships, and I think a couple have come to mind, and some of them the jury's still out. But I think when we're able to leverage additional expertise and kind of align the incentives so that, you know, so that there is an actual win-win or win-win-win, that's where I think we see the future of those projects sustaining themselves over time. So we just signed a deal in Colombia with Starbucks, where they're going to help train some farmers, and we're going to put in some money into that to help improve the agricultural yields of their coffee work. Obviously, Colombians know a lot about coffee. They're selling it to themselves, basically, that Starbucks is then turning around and selling back to Colombians. But that's an effort where we have some interest in the geographic distribution of the investments that Starbucks is making. Our interests are driven by the government of Colombia's interests, as well as they have an interest in getting better coffee. So that sort of makes perfect sense in terms of that investment. Overall, the Colombia story is one from Washington that is told with a lot of enthusiasm, and I think the biggest number there is that we used to pay, you know, tiny percentages, we used to pay millions, many millions of dollars of certain institutions or agencies within the government of Colombia. We'd pay 80% of the budget of, you know, Colombia Responde, an effort that was really working to get what they call consolidation of state services out into rural areas. Today, we pay a fraction of that overall budget. Not only do we pay an absolute sum that is much smaller, but as a percentage of the overall size of the agency, it's now like 2% or 5% of what was used to be, you know, an overwhelming investment. So that's exactly the kind of trajectory that we think you know, makes sense. And it says, like, look, we start something, we seed fund something. Actually, an organization that a couple of the Salvadorans in the room have some experience with, you know, think tanks in the region that are fantastically useful and have a tremendous resource base of their own that is not, you know, foreign money, but it's domestic money that they've been able to raise. Those are the kinds of successes where we can see, you know, a sustained path forward that doesn't depend on the ongoing investment of a foreign donor. I think, you know, there are also spot efforts in Haiti, even in places where you know, the challenges have been dire and discouraging for a long time. We do see significant improvements there, and have, you know, reason for optimism moving forward.
Well, thank you. Sorry I didn't get to go through all the questions. We're out of time. There's coffee in the back, and so that'll probably be useful for our next panel, which starts in five minutes? Yeah, in 5 minutes, and it'll be our last panel of the day on democracy. So thank you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.